You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by UC Berkeley PhD candidate Matthew Tarduno. Matt talks with us about his paper comparing congestion and economic impacts of ride-hailing companies, Uber and Lyft before and after the cessation of service in Austin, Texas. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting this podcast as well as Mondays at the Overhead Wire. We couldn't produce the show without your help. To join this merry band of dreamers and support the show, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. For $2 a month, we'll send you stickers and a handwritten note. For $10 a month, we'll send you one of our famous bus-only scarves. We just got in a new shipment, so are ready for the new year. Today's podcast is also brought to you by the projects of the Overhead Wire, sharing information on cities around the world with our readers and subscribers. Join us and try our one-of-a-kind daily newsletter for 2 weeks free. No credit cards, just an email address by visiting theoverheadwire.com. We've got 71,000 news links in our archive tagged by topic, so sign up and search away. And finally, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic, Town Planning in Practice. Go to raymondunwin.com to find out how you can download the book in your podcatcher and listen to each chapter like an episode of the show. We have a free Word document with timestamps on the site as well. Well, Matt Tarduno, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Thanks for joining us. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a fourth year PhD candidate at UC Berkeley. I'm in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics. My research focuses mainly on transportation policy and climate policy.
That's interesting. So you're in the agricultural economics school, but then you're doing research on ride hailing.
Right. Yeah. People often, it's a bit of a head scratcher when they see kind of my subject line of my email.
How do those two things intersect?
Yeah. So my department is named Agriculture and Resource Economics, but it largely acts as an applied economics program. So students and faculty study environmental economics, development economics, and agricultural economics.
So how did you get into economics?
Yeah, actually, I kind of backed in a way. So my high school had an economics requirement. Your senior year, you had to take econ or test out of it. And the test was notoriously easy. And so people would kind of study last minute and try to pass the test. And I did that and failed. And so I was required to take an actual econ class. But my high school had a great offering through Syracuse University called Syracuse University Project Advance. And they kind of would pair with the university with high school teachers. And I had a really engaging teacher and kind of enjoyed the coursework. And that was around the time, like middle of the Great Recession, and Freakonomics was coming out. So I was just kind of swept up in it. And I continued to take classes through college, even though that wasn't kind of initially where I intended to go. It stuck around, and as time went on, I became more and more interested in it.
The study that you wrote is about ride hailing, specifically Uber and Lyft. But, what kind of brought you to that topic?
So one of my first real jobs was actually in the transportation and congestion space. So my senior year of college, before my senior year of college, I was kind of at a fork in the road, and I had the opportunity. I had 2 summer job offers, and one was to go do environmental consulting, and I was going to go either to Juneau, Alaska and fly in bush planes and do environmental consulting there, or move to LA and work for a state senator there on a transportation planning project. So if you know the 710 freeway and the entire kind of decades long debate over whether or not that freeway should be finished. And I ended up moving to LA and working, just kind of diving into the environmental impact statement about this freeway. And I learned a lot kind of just on the fly about traffic congestion and induced demand. And so that was something that's just kind of lodged in my head. And then when I found myself in grad school a couple of years later, learning about externalities, congestion had always kind of been on my mind. And this paper actually evolved out of a second year project. So everybody in my department, you write a second year paper and you kind of go through a mock process of the peer review. And so I wrote mine about this causal question of, do ride sharing companies cause traffic congestion? And I got really positive feedback on it. So continued to work on it, and it evolved into this paper.
And what did you learn about the 710 freeway? That's the vexing question of the day.
Yeah. So it was interesting that I was really brought in to kind of write an opinionated review of the environmental impact statement. I guess I can kind of say this now because I've long left that office. So for people who might not be in the know, the 710 is this freeway that was kind of slated to be built and it stopped in the 60s. It was in Pasadena, California. And so right now the 710 freeway basically just stops and it doesn't connect to kind of like the north and south parts of these communities in LA. And so the question is, do they want to finish the freeway or do they want to bore a tunnel like underneath existing houses to finish the freeway? And basically when you look at it, any way of finishing that freeway is going to be incredibly expensive. And it's an open question as to whether or not it would relieve congestion at all. And so that's kind of where the question of induced demand comes in, is if you build more capacity, is that going to relieve congestion or not? And kind of the evidence is mixed on that, but it suggests not, if anything. And so it's probably not a good use of public funds to finish that freeway, is kind of like my personal opinion. And that happened to be also the greater opinion of the office that I was working for. So it was nice that summer to kind of like be in a place where, as I was looking at the data, I didn't have to like spin it in some way that I didn't want to. But I think it was also like leaving that, it was clear that I didn't want to work directly in government, because it was somewhat uncomfortable. Like at certain times, if I would like chafe with bosses or like people and trying to write something in a more objective manner, and they're like, well, like, what about this? At some points, I found that uncomfortable. But overall, it was certainly a trial by fire, and I learned so much about moving away from just like the theory of traffic congestion to like how policies and decisions are made in practice.
There's so much interesting things that have come out of that process, especially the purchase of property by Caltrans, and they owned it for a long time, and then housing was built on there or was
Yes.
not removed. And so there's this whole saga of people being allowed or not allowed to buy houses they lived in forever. And then there's a TOD where the gold line went through. Just a lot of interesting kind of background. If anybody gets a chance to kind of go and dig into the weeds, I imagine if you Google it, you'll find a lot of information about kind of the background. I agree with you. I didn't think the 710 connection was very valuable at this time. Yeah, but it's totally an interesting project, or not project for that matter.
Yes, exactly. Right.
A situation, as it were.
An interesting way to demonstrate that like what could have been in the 60s does not mean what should be now.
Right. So you wrote a paper entitled "The Congestion Costs of Lyft and Uber" in the Journal of Urban Economics. I'm curious what the impetus was. I mean, you kind of explained a little bit, but what the impetus was for, going and thinking about Austin, for pulling the information about this and thinking about congestion specifically as it pertains to ride hailing.
Yeah, so the kind of the intellectual history of this project would be that I was interested just in the causal question of, do ride sharing companies impact congestion? And kind of just stepping away from maybe some of the valence of this question, the answer could go either way. Either they are, after all, called ride sharing companies sometimes. You could imagine that either the ride sharing effect could dominate, and that if people are actually using Uber and Lyft to carpool, congestion could go down as these companies expand. Alternatively, there are a lot of people who use Uber and Lyft who don't have vehicles or who might use them differently than they would their personal car. And so you could imagine that Uber and Lyft could add cars to the road and make congestion worse. So when I started thinking about this problem, there were a couple of studies that had looked into this, some using Uber data, some using just city-specific data. But the one thing that I noticed is that all of these studies kind of looked at the change in Uber entering cities. And there's kind of an interesting causal question there, in that like you can say, okay, in between 2010, say, and 2016, traffic got worse in a city, and also the use of Uber and Lyft increased. But that doesn't necessarily mean, right? Correlation does not mean causation. So it's not clear that that increased congestion was caused by Uber and Lyft, because there are a lot of other changes that are happening in between 2010 and 2016. Like, we're coming out of a recession, there's gentrification, there's the expansion of companies like Amazon. So what I wanted to do is kind of find an example where you had a really abrupt change in Uber service, where you had, say, a disrupting the disruptor. I kind of went from city to city and looked at cases where Uber and Lyft had exited. Either they had chosen to exit or they were forced to exit. And then I checked which cities kind of had reasonable traffic data that I could use to answer that question. And Austin was kind of the intersection of that Venn diagram. They have great traffic data. And then also there's this great natural experiment where Uber and Lyft left for a year. And so that's why Austin.
The Austin story is really interesting. What's the background on why Uber and Lyft left Austin?
Yeah, so Uber and Lyft left Austin in May of 2016, and that was following a vote to overturn a local ordinance. So that's all that's one big sentence. So I'll kind of break that down. So in 2015, Austin passed a local ordinance regulating rideshare. So that said, among other things, that rideshare needed to share data with the city and they needed to do background checks on drivers. And Uber and Lyft were not a fan of this ordinance. And I think they made kind of like a big stir about the background checks, but also under the radar, I think they were probably very unhappy about sharing their data. And so what they did, and this is becoming like more common, is they backed a ballot proposal to overturn kind of this regulation against them. So we saw this again recently in California. But unlike the recent California story, in this case, the proposition that Uber and Lyft backed failed. And then so Uber and Lyft kind of made good on their threat and they left 2 days after it failed. So May 9th, 2016, the companies stopped operating.
Yeah, it was interesting, all the stuff that happened at that time. I actually went to school in Austin, and so I pay a little bit of closer attention to what goes on there sometimes. And, it was interesting to see kind of all the commentary from all of my Facebook friends and everything. And people were not happy with Uber and Lyft at the time, and especially drivers, people that were driving for Uber and Lyft. They were like, you're leaving us, you're abandoning us. There was interesting things about how Houston, for example, had the background checks and they didn't want it in Austin. But your point about data is really interesting. So there was just so much going on and just kind of left. And I think people felt like they were left in a lurch to a certain extent because they'd come to depend on the ride hailing to get to, late night 6th Street and things like that. So it is an interesting thing that happened. I'm also kind of interested, there was, after Lyft and Uber left, there was a nonprofit organization, Ride Austin, that kind of took over. Does that play into the discussion much as well? The replacement by another kind of service or other services?
Yeah, and kind of in a couple ways that's important for this paper and kind of the conversation more generally. Before we get into that, I do want to ask though, did you ever ride with Ride Austin?
I did, yeah.
Yeah. What was that experience like?
It was great. It was expensive, but it was great. And I get, that's the thing is like Uber and Lyft are popular, I think, in part because they are lowering prices below what actually the cost of the rides are. And we'll get to the economic part in a bit, but I think that's something that probably surprised a bunch of people because Ride Austin, they had to pay for all of what they were doing. They didn't have a lot of money behind them. So, if you want to ride from the Arboretum all the way down to the airport, it was going to cost you $70, $80, which is something that you'd probably pay for a taxi to get to an airport in any other city. But, that's the cost, right? So
yeah.
I didn't use it necessarily to get around the city, but I did use it to get to the airport.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's kind of tied into one of the things that I do in the paper is, spoiler alert, I'll share that I found small impacts of these companies on traffic speeds that they cause mild congestion. And so what I do is I compare those costs to kind of what are the benefits of these companies. And one way to do that is to look at consumer surplus. So kind of like how much are people getting from these companies compared to what they would be willing to pay. And I think this kind of illustrates that Uber and Lyft are significant urban amenities. And so when we think about kind of the implications that they have for, say, congestion or public safety, we also have to weigh that against, these considerable benefits that Uber and Lyft really are like head and shoulders efficiency-wise above the competition. And now, yes, there's an open question of whether or not like that could continue forever and whether or not this is just kind of like burning up a VC runway or not. But for the time being,
also a question about what efficiency actually means, I'm sure.
Right. Yes.
Especially in cities that have kind of larger bases and, places like San Francisco, maybe New York City in the urban core. But yeah, that's the finding I think that a lot of people kind of gravitated to was the finding that there were congestion impacts. And after Uber and Lyft left Austin, congestion was reduced, you found, by anywhere between 1 and, I think it was 3% or something, 1 and 5%, something around those lines.
Yeah. So the daytime speed increased 2.3% on average. And these effects might be heterogeneous by location or by weekend versus weekday. But kind of any way you slice it, you're not going to have an effect that's, say, less than 1% or greater than about 5%.
And also, one other thing that was interesting you found was the economic impacts. When Uber and Lyft leave, there's a benefit from a congestion reduction standpoint, but then there's also a loss of a service that people use.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, so to kind of like be clear about exactly what I did is I said, okay, like these companies seem to have slowed traffic. There's kind of like a broad literature on what people are willing to pay for reductions in travel time. And so I kind of take a couple different sources of data, some just from Austin, some from kind of national surveys, and say, let's price this. Let's say, take the congestion impacts and assign a dollar value to them. And so what I find is that the slowdowns caused by these companies cost Austinites roughly $30 to $50 million a year. And then, so it's like, okay, that's a number that we have up on the wall. What should we make of this? And kind of how would we compare it to the benefits of these companies? And one thing that we can do is look at what do consumers get out of it. So forgetting the supply side for a second, forgetting kind of the profits to Uber or even the benefits to gig workers, we can look at what consumers get. And there's a great paper by authors at the University of Chicago using Uber data. And what they do is they kind of calculate the consumer surplus in this like very cool and data intensive method. And I kind of take their figures and do back of the envelope calculations for Austin. And when I run those numbers, I find that consumer surplus from ride sharing is about the same. So $40 to $70 million a year. And so what that means is that if you were to just like, again, go to Austin and say, no more ride sharing, at least comparing congestion and consumer surplus, it's roughly a transfer. And so when you're thinking about policy, is it like, well, these companies are bad for congestion, so we should outright ban them? That's kind of like one end of the extremity spectrum of what you could do in terms of policy. It seems like that's probably a policy where the costs outweigh the benefits.
It's interesting to think about benefits and value and what that actually means. I know from here in California and Prop 22 passing, and also there was an article, I think, in a number of different publications the other day about Uber saying that it wants the EU to adopt Prop 22-like mechanisms, which the EU seems like a even harder place to do that than, say, than California with its ballot initiatives. But, I always am trying to think about like value that's created and how we calculate it. And so, when you talk about congestion, I often kind of push back sometimes on the idea that, congestion in the TTI reports, the Texas Transportation Institute, or even INRIX reports, they actually measure congestion accurately. I mean, one of the times there was a TTI speaker and they were at a conference and they were talking about their congestion report. And for me, as somebody who took BART to Oakland every day for 8 years, I never saw any of that congestion. And so it's kind of a weird calculation to me. And especially if you're measuring things based on whether people have free flow freeway speeds, which is, maybe that's not so good for urban life overall, because that means that place is dead. And so, I'm wondering like if there is kind of an alternative take on the value that some of these companies create. We can see that they benefit a lot of people in terms of getting from one place to another for an inexpensive ride. But then there's externalities, quote unquote externalities, that come about. There's pollution, there's the impact on people's wages and gig workers and things like that. There's also, like you said, there's traffic generally and all those things. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I think a good place to start is asking kind of value and costs for whom. So Austin, generally speaking, right, like not all Austinites are going to use ride sharing. And I think just like a good place to start is looking at, say, Pew data and finding out like, okay, who are rideshare users? And then if there are costs to using that platform, like who bears the cost? And so the first question is, are those two separate groups at all, right? Because if it's the same people who drive who also use ride sharing and they're just kind of like congesting like each other back and forth, then in some sense it's a wash. But I think where people might be a little bit more uncomfortable is if one kind of group is using a platform and that's imposing costs on others that don't reap the benefits of that platform, right? And so like if you look at the data on who's using ride sharing companies, it skews young and it skews high income. And then it also skews like people who do not own a car. And then if you ask, say, let's just for a second think about congestion externalities, who bears the brunt of those? It's people who drive a lot and people who don't have access to other modes of transportation. And so if you kind of like do a Venn diagram of who's in these different groups, there is kind of a slice of the population that is probably lower income car users who might not have access to other modes of transit, who also aren't using ride sharing apps. And they're kind of bearing a lot of the brunt of the congestion, but they're not in the group that's kind of reaping the benefits.
You also mentioned in your Twitter explainer about the paper that you didn't think taxation could be expected to deliver those congestion reduction outcomes. I'm curious about that as well.
Right. Yeah. And so if we take a step back just to kind of the overall impact of these companies, right, we're talking about 1%, 5%. And if we just look at the past decade of kind of like how traffic speeds have decreased, kind of the median American city has seen like a much greater decrease in traffic speeds than can be explained, say if Austin were representative. And so I don't think we should expect, say, policies reducing the number of Uber and Lyft vehicles or policies aimed to tax Uber and Lyft to generate large congestion effects. Because if you think about entirely eliminating ride sharing in Austin, that delivered maybe a 5% increase in traffic speeds. And taxation is going to reduce TNC activity less than would entirely removing the companies from a city. So you might be talking about a fraction of a percent of increase in traffic speeds. And that's kind of backed up by just like looking at the number of TNC vehicles on the road versus total vehicles.
I think, one of the interesting parts too is that for mid-sized cities, I feel like that makes a lot of sense. But when you get to space-constrained places, that might be a little bit harder. In the Manhattans, in the downtown San Franciscos, in the downtown Seattles, the places that kind of are space-constrained, there's a lot of people trying to get a lot of places. There's a good transit network already. It seems like there are places where it might not have as much impact. I personally have thought that Austin should do a cordon in the downtown for a long time, just for traffic generally, because they only have those two north-south freeways and people kind of come in at certain points, or even a couple of north-south streets that get blocked off by the state capitol and University of Texas through the center of the city. But for places like, for Indianapolis or other mid-sized cities, it seems like, there's really no reason to do a congestion charge to try to limit the 5% maybe that an Uber and Lyft might cause.
Right. Yeah. And I think I'm going to take 2 points from that. And so the first is that, right, this is a study in Austin, and I find relatively modest impacts. And so the question is, right, is Austin representative of San Francisco or New York? And there are plenty of reasons to think that it might not be.
Right.
So then the question is, well, maybe you'd want to tax these companies in New York or in San Francisco. And I think the response to that is then, right, like, why not tax all vehicles? Why focus on Uber and Lyft specifically? And kind of the answer to that might be, well, if you think that Uber and Lyft are specifically congesting, right? If you think that these companies, you can either target congestion better, or that they are, say, because of the way that they idle or the way that they pull in and out of traffic, they might be specifically worse for traffic than is your average vehicle. Those are the situations where you'd want to say, okay, a congestion tax is a well-targeted instrument. And so what I find from the Austin paper is like, that doesn't seem to hold up, but it would be great if we had kind of another natural experiment in San Francisco or New York, or if somebody could answer those questions that, like, is it the specific way that these vehicles drive that kind of would rationalize a tax targeted just at them? And you had one other point, which was, are there kind of places or times, right, where you might really want to impose regulation on Uber and Lyft? And I do like the idea of, say, at airports or specific areas, say, you had a specific example that you'd cited in Austin of like where, transit might be specifically bad, but I live in Berkeley, and there's kind of in downtown Berkeley, there's just like one segment of storefronts, which are incredibly popular for takeout. So Uber Eats and people jumping in and out. There's an acute congestion problem, and it seems to be specifically Uber and Lyft. And so I'm not saying to kind of the Berkeley city commissioners that they should look into this, but if you were to imagine a scenario where Berkeley were to want to tax Uber and Lyft, it would be because of a situation like that, because those cars, more than other cars, are kind of contributing to the problem. But I think overall, right, cities in terms of congestion just have a total VMT problem. They don't seem to have a ride sharing problem right now.
Yeah, and I would probably agree with that. I think that it's an overall kind of travel problem. And as we're finding out through the pandemic, the delivery increases that are happening in cities are getting bigger as well. And so it's not just ride hailing that necessarily is the problem, but overall transportation, impacts that, when you can't get your bus through an intersection because there are too many vehicles, whether it's Uber or Lyft or somebody's personal vehicle, that tends to be a problem. And I do like your idea about, and you mentioned it kind of in your recommendations about zonal charging, where basically if you have a space like you were just mentioning in Berkeley that has this really kind of a crush of people trying to get there, and I'm thinking about curb kind of management type stuff, there might be a benefit to figuring out how to tax, curb access. And that might not just affect, delivery drivers. It would affect the deliveries like that are not food, et cetera, or people. It would also affect packages and those types of things from FedEx, UPS, et cetera. And so that might be an interesting way to look at things, is if you're worried about congestion, or if you're worried about, people getting to where they want to go in a reasonable amount of time, it might be to target those specific places where people are going. Another thing I found interesting from your research was that a lot of the congestion that you're finding was not coming during rush hour. It was coming during kind of midday trips. And so that was something that I think kind of targets that specific thing that we're talking about before with the zonal charging, is that those are the trips that are happening that wouldn't have happened before that maybe are causing problems.
Yeah, precisely. And right, if we think about what's actually happening with these platforms, kind of there is like a rationing going on within them. You could imagine that people aren't using Uber and Lyft during the middle of the day the same way that they are in the evening hours, right? There's surge pricing and people might be more willing to carpool in the evenings. And then overall, if you look at kind of the profile of Uber and Lyft trips, so I use Ride Austin's data actually to kind of get a sense of when people are using more or less ride sharing during the day. And it of course peaks during evening rush hour, but relative to other traffic, it's highest during the middle of the day. And that might be, right, I don't have specific data on this, but one reason for that could be exactly what you propose, is that that's when you have additional trips, and those additional trips might be the trips that are just a single occupant. And so you don't kind of also benefit from that ride sharing effect.
It would be interesting to know kind of where those trips all went after Lyft and Uber left Austin, because another thing that I've been thinking about when I was reading through the paper was, Portland and Joe Courtwright and some others have calculated what they are calling a green dividend. And so if you can reduce VMT and get more people riding transit, biking, active transportation modes versus driving, you actually take money away from interests that are exporting money outside of the region, right? So if you're driving your car, you're paying a gas company who's going to take a lot of those profits out of the region and put it somewhere else. But if you're spending that money locally, you're actually driving the local economy. And I'm curious if there's like some sort of effect like that might happen, if that might have happened even in Austin after Uber and Lyft left, since the money that wasn't necessarily leaving the city.
Yeah, so I'm not so sure about money, but I can speak to the first question of kind of where are these trips going.
Mm-hmm.
And so this isn't from my research, but some great research by Hampshire et al. Out of University of Michigan did a survey after Uber and Lyft exited Austin. And they just asked people kind of, okay, think of, first of all, do you use these companies? Second of all, think of a reference trip, a reference Uber or Lyft trip. And now that these companies are no longer available to you, what do you use instead? And I think this was in November of 2016. And so a fair share of people had transferred over to an alternative ride sharing service. That was about half. About 40% didn't take the trip at all. And then there was kind of a small share for biking and walking. But it wasn't a huge amount of trips that were replaced by kind of like an alternative method of transportation, or a kind of walking or biking, or something that you might imagine is kind of has these positive local impacts. I think it's an interesting question about where the money is going when you're using like transportation services. And specifically, right, Uber and Lyft have been kind of criticized for eroding revenues of city governments if people are using parking less, or registering vehicles less, registering for parking permits less. And I think, right, one of the upshots of the paper is maybe you don't want to tax Uber and Lyft for congestion purposes, but I want to be careful to say that doesn't mean you shouldn't tax them generally. You just might want to do it for another reason. And I think it's a perfectly fine idea to target those companies if you think that they're eroding a revenue base and they're using your public good, right? They're using the streets and the roads. And so it shouldn't be the case, right, that they can kind of like go to whatever city in the US, use that public infrastructure, and then siphon the revenues to San Francisco or wherever they're headquartered now.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the argument as well for even a congestion charge generally, is that you can take that money and put it into transit, or you can put it into other transportation modes that help the people that aren't driving or they're not taking ride hail, et cetera. So it's an interesting thought about that kind of transfer that cities are thinking about.
Right. Yeah. So my advisor here at Berkeley, Jim Salee, he's working on a paper right now that's kind of trying to answer this difficult question about who bears the cost of congestion and what you could do with the revenue in terms of trying to make people whole or reduce the regressivity of these policies, right? So it's one thing to kind of like sit here and talk about efficiency and congestion pricing, but it's well established, right? If you're not careful about what you do with the money, that's going to have a regressive impact. So the question is, how do you want to spend those funds? Is it best to just give people rebates? Can you kind of identify the losers from this policy and try to make them whole? Or is it better to kind of target other areas where you think there could be a beneficial public good provided, public transportation, for example? And one, is that going to benefit the right people? And two, is that going to kind of bolster the popularity of these policies in general? Because that's one big hang up, is kind of in the march to make better use of our existing transit infrastructure through congestion pricing, you have to make these policies politically palatable. And I think one way to do that I know San Francisco and New York are thinking really hard about right now is exactly right, like who needs to pay, who gets reimbursed, and what projects the money gets spent on.
Yeah, tough questions for sure, especially if you think about politics and the way it operates at the moment, even in San Francisco, which is a weird duck for some. We had Haley Rubinson from Revel on recently in the last couple of weeks, and, they left Austin because, there wasn't much happening. Part of it was, I think, the way that the city's laid out, the density of the city. Those short trips are harder to make, I think, if you're a less dense city and less places to go. And then also, because of the pandemic, there's been a lack of festivals and, things that would attract people to a place like Austin typically. And it makes me think about, what happened after ride-hailing left. And it makes me also think about, and we talk about this a little bit, but like the density of cities and what that means for these services. And is it the same to, be worried about congestion inside the core versus kind of on the periphery where, even the ride hailing companies have a hard time making any money, or drivers have a hard time making any money because of the deadhead trips and things like that. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about density and what that means for these services as a whole.
Sure. Yeah, I think one thing, just kind of a blanket statement, is that we have to be very careful for any findings porting from one city to another city, right? Cities have idiosyncratic geography and transit systems, and it's really hard to make general statements. That being said, I guess one kind of like way to help thinking about congestion is an externality that you may want to price because it has external costs on other users. And so there's kind of a distinction to be made between just like gross VMT and the implications that might have of having, say, like moving a city away from a road-based transit network to a system that's based on bikes or trains or buses. That could be one policy goal, but that's not directly related to congestion, right? Congestion is a problem of people not bearing the full consequences of their actions, right? And so I think it's useful to, when thinking about policy and whether or not you want to price roads, say, to disentangle those two goals. And so there might be kind of a synergy in between them, specifically if the projects that you need to bring us away from kind of a 1960s view of a car-based city, congestion pricing might be one policy to help you gain the revenue to do that. But it's not necessarily the right policy for every city. If every city doesn't kind of have these, easy to target problems with really acute congestion where people are not kind of exposed to the full cost of their actions, then it might not be the right policy tool, right? If you have a really sprawling city and it's not easy to price the right roads, or if you just end up, say, pricing segments of roads where people substitute to another road, then that's not really a policy that is kind of achieving the congestion pricing ideal, I would say.
So what's next in terms of the direction of your research, where it's going? And is there anything else you want to know moving forward after writing this paper? I'm sure there's many things, but.
Sure, yeah. So I'll say two research projects that are kind of related. So the first is a project in the Bay Area, and I'm looking at transit, so traffic congestion, traffic composition, and local air pollution. So this is a similar project where I'm just looking at potential policies that would impact the way that people use roads and what vehicles use them and don't. But this time, instead of looking at the impact on other drivers and travel speeds, I'm looking at the impacts on local air pollution, right? Another kind of significant urban disamenity. And so to do that, I'm kind of taking data from Google self-driving cars, which for the past couple of years have been retrofitted with air pollution sensing devices. And so they have, millions of data points throughout the Bay Area, giving this really fine scale resolution image of air pollution for the region. And then what I want to do is ask, okay, what are the main drivers of that local air pollution from the transit system? And what would an optimal policy look like if we were to target those local air pollutants? Right. So we have evidence already that road pricing or congestion pricing can have local air pollution benefits. So there's a study from Milan showing that their congestion price had benefits for local air pollution. But the question is, right, is that because cars are driving faster and they're more efficient when they drive faster? Is it just that we're taking cars off the road and you could just as efficiently do this by, say, having a VMT tax? Or is it a story about composition, right? Most of the pollution comes from a very small class of cars, being this like diesel trucks and like light duty trucks rather than your Priuses, et cetera. So that's kind of broadly construed the research question there. And then, the second question, and this is something that I think would be a smaller research project, but it's directly related to my Uber paper, is we actually have cities, right, that have taxed Uber now. And so that's San Francisco, New York, Chicago. Some of those went into place during the pandemic. So it's kind of hard to figure out exactly what's going on and what that would look like in a world where people are making decisions like they would if they were all vaccinated, for example. But given that data, you kind of no longer have to speculate about how these companies would respond to taxation. You can say, hey, look, like we found these results from Austin. It doesn't look like there would be big congestion impacts if you were to tax these companies. Then you can take it to another city and try to answer that question as is. And hopefully that would give some insight as well into kind of your questions of, well, Austin is Austin and San Francisco is San Francisco. They're very different places. So you kind of have like real policy vary in different cities. That's another thing that I would love to dive into.
I wonder how much the pandemic just changes all the calculus in terms of travel, right? All these companies that want some of their workers to stay home twice a week, or they allow them to stay home twice a week. I wonder if there's a negative impact on, the things that I love, transit and active transportation, or there's maybe a positive. Maybe because you're only coming into the office 3 times a week, you think you can afford not to take that auto trip because you feel like you have a little bit more time. Who knows? So it's interesting to see kind of how all this stuff will either evolve, change, or kind of get thrown out the window when it comes to the after effects.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there are a lot of countervailing forces going on here. It remains to be seen how much coronavirus will be a problem in 2022, kind of what happens with herd immunity and vaccination. But yeah, you can imagine right now we're seeing people are really staying away from public transit and sticking to passenger vehicles. But at the same time, you have this kind of counteracting force where people are staying home more. So at least in the Bay Area, traffic and congestion are down, but you could imagine how that would be a different story as workplaces. If workplaces open up and we don't see the return to public transit to levels pre-pandemic.
Yeah, we'll find out.
That we will.
Matt, where can folks find you online?
You can find me on Twitter. That's at Matt Tarduno. That's Tarduno. And you can also check out my website. That's Matt-Tarduno at github.io. And so in addition to, you can find the ungated version of my paper. So unfortunately, the actual paper, you have to get past a paywall. But I have a draft of my paper up on my website, as well as some other fun things, political economy projects about voting and renewable portfolio standards, as well as a little bit about me.
Cool. And also in the show notes, I'll post the link to the paper that you have ungated.
Great.
And we'll get that out there as well so people can take a read if they want to dive deeper.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Matt, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me so much.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire on the web at theoverheadwire.com. Sign up for a free trial of The Overhead Wire Daily, our 14-year-old Daily Cities news list by clicking the link at the top right of theoverheadwire.com. And please support the pod on patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Many thanks to our current patrons for their ongoing support. And as always, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And you can always find its original home at USA.org. www.streetsblog.org. See you next time at Talking Headways.